Welcome. So we've said this is a class in rhetorical criticism. In the next few lessons, we're going to turn our attention to the criticism part of that equation. We're going to be examining criticism itself. We'll break that down into three major steps, which we will introduce as sort of discrete lessons. So in the first lesson, we're going to talk about the definition of criticism and how basically criticism functions, essentially. In that initial section, we'll touch ever so briefly on the relationship between criticism and theory. That relationship is one we'll be back to later, but we'll just touch on the basics here. We'll move on then to our second lesson. And in the second one, we'll outline the sort of broad areas in which criticism takes place as we've defined it. There are two primary arenas of criticism. We are mostly interested in the second one, and we'll look at both of those arenas, but the second one is the one that we'll examine in the most detail in this second section. We'll look at the subdivisions of that arena. We're even going to look at the subdivisions of the subdivisions there. So we're going to get some taxonomy, and as we break that taxonomy out, that series of classifications, we're going to come eventually to focus on our own area of communication studies, and especially rhetoric when we get there. Then that'll transition us into the third lesson. And in that lesson, we'll talk about essentially how we do criticism, and that means we're going to explain the idea of methods in our own world and how they guide critical enterprises. Now, this third section, this third lesson, will, to a large degree, we're going to touch back to ideas in the first lesson. It's going to be a review, but it will begin with an overview of the major sets of communication methods, and then we'll follow that with a closer look at the methods in rhetorical criticism. That final lesson will bring us sort of full circle back to the basics of theory and the relationship between methods and theory in communication studies. Basics. This third lesson is going to review what we've discovered in the first lesson. It's going to go a little bit deeper, and it will approach that idea of the relationship between method and theory from slightly different angles and introduce the idea of theory in a deeper and more robust way, but again, introduce only. We'll talk about theory more as we move ahead in the semester, but in this third lesson, you're basically just going to barely meet the two large meta-theories, the two theoretical schools, if you wish to think of it in those terms. So, let's get started. First things first, what is criticism? Obviously, the popular definition of criticism is pointing out the flaws that somebody or something has. If I criticize you in popular parlance, I am stating things that I see that you have in you that are out of place. I'm basically talking about what's wrong with you. But of course, that is not what we mean in the academic world of communication studies when we talk about criticism. For us, criticism, it may very well point out problems inside the thing we're criticizing, but it also points out strengths. The word criticism is rooted, like much of our understanding in communication, in the ancient Greek perspectives of the world. The basic word in Greek is krisis, which is a noun, and its adjective form kritikos. Krisis referred to the ability to distinguish between what was important and what was not important. It also meant a judgment or a choice that was made. Krisis gave us the English word crisis, right? A crisis is a moment when judgment is required, when you have to embrace and endorse some hierarchy, some distinction between things that matter and things that do not matter as much. In a crisis, you don't have the liberty of making everything the same or everything equal. So you can see how the word kritikos is related to krisis. Kritikos is a critical moment when you have to make a decision to embrace a hierarchy of one thing being better and something else being worse. So where we say, X is good here, but Y is less good and Z is bad. That's kritikos. Now, in our field, this is not true everywhere, but in communication, the object, the something, the thingy that we are making our critical judgments about, the thing we're judging is called our artifact, or it is called our text. So an artifact or a text for us can be any event where communication is taking place. So you may hear me use those terms, artifact, text, and when I do this, I'm talking about the thing you are criticizing, like a speech or a scene out of a TV show or a political advertisement or a monument. Any of those might be rhetorical artifacts. So that's what we do as critics. We make careful judgments about some artifact. Okay, that judgment will highlight some issues as more relevant or more influential or more significant or more important in this communication event, in this artifact, than other issues are. So we can, in the end, define criticism this way. Criticism is a process of making reasoned judgments. So there it is. Criticism is a process of making reasoned judgments. Now, of course, as with all things in academia, we're going to need to define our definition, of course. That's kind of what we do in the academic world. What we can say at this point, though, is that every word, every idea in that definition is important. And we are going to look at each of them one after another. We are going to look at both process, followed by reasoning, followed by judgments. So, we start by saying criticism is a process. What we mean here is that criticism takes time. Criticism is absolutely not an immediate reaction to our artifact. Criticism is absolutely not a statement about what you like or dislike about this artifact or this text. It is absolutely not a statement about how you feel about this artifact you're criticizing. None of that matters in criticism. Okay, well, maybe it matters to some degree to you and it helps shape you a little bit, but that's not what you as a critic are going to report on. Criticism does not report on your agreement or your disagreement. It does not report on your preferences, on your likes, or on your feelings. That's not what we do in criticism. Good criticism will go through a sort of a longer process. It will be a process that involves reflection. And that longer process will shape. It should be a process that matures, that provides nuance to our report about this artifact. It's that reflection, as opposed to a reaction, it's that reflection that we want to capture and we want to emphasize in the next word in our definition. So criticism is a process of making reasoned judgments. Now, it's true, your reactions and your gut level feelings about a movie, for example, that you've just seen, those are certainly a judgment you make. But what makes those reactions different from criticism is that the critic goes through a process of careful reasoning before issuing critical judgments. So to be clear, the reasoning we are talking about here is not some haphazard. It's not some half-baked echo chamber where you just go looking for ways to confirm your gut level feelings. That is absolutely, emphatically not the kind of reasoning that a critic does. We're talking about rather a kind of reasoning and reflecting that's rooted in a sort of careful and systematic consideration of the artifact and disciplined reflection on what is really present here, how this artifact works to communicate meaning, the way the different parts of the artifact are linked together and lead to one another. That's what reasoning means in criticism. In other words, you need a disciplined plan. You need a well thought out set of directions to help guide you as you set out to engage in the process of reasoning about your artifact. That reasoning will follow a set of directions, the disciplined set of directions for how you're going to reason about your artifact. We call that a method. That's all we mean by the word method. A method is a step-by-step set of directions that you can follow in order to think more carefully, more thoroughly, in a disciplined, well-considered, well-thought-out way, in a manner that will, if you exercise a bit of self-control, get you to an understanding of your artifact that is going to go deeper and is better than your first reactions. That method is going to be an important part that guides you. Now, that gets us to the very heart of criticism. Criticism is a judgment we make about the artifact, or a set of judgments. Our method shows us what is present in the artifact. It tells us what we have here, what the parts are, how they work together to craft an idea, and to provide us with a sense of meaning in our heart and in our mind and in our will. Method gives us a blueprint of the structure that holds up this artifact. It's once we have those parts and functions in front of us, that's the bare minimum that our method will provide for us. But at that point, then we have to go on and we have to make our own judgments about what happened. You make that judgment about the strengths and the weaknesses, things done poorly, things done well. Once the method shows us what the pieces are and how those pieces work together, we make a judgment about what happens in the text in this artifact. And even here, we do not get to talk about agreement or disagreement. We don't suddenly, when we get to the judgment part of criticism, we don't suddenly start writing an editorial, right? A critic is always above and outside the argument, the meaning, the claims that are being made in the text. So the critic always stays above the fray in terms of what the argument is that's going on here. Now, that said, your judgment is obviously going to follow from a specific perspective, a position, a worldview that you have and that you bring to this project. That worldview brings us back to the idea of our ancient Greek friends, okay? The word theoreo in Greek means to see, to look at. It implies, a perspective, an angle from which you're viewing something. It means to look at, to consider, actually to contemplate, to really reflect on deeply. Not contemplate in a mystical sense, but in terms of giving something your full, complete attention. That's what we mean. Theoreo, as you can probably guess, gives us in English the word theory. So it's fair to say theory is a form of contemplation, of looking intently. Again, not in a mystical or religious sense, but in the academic sense of thinking really hard and long about what you see, giving something really intense, focused attention. Judgment, rooted in theory, is where you sit somewhere and you deeply, you quietly, you honestly reflect on what you have discovered by following the path that your method laid out for you. These deep, focused, intense reflections will lead you to judgments. Now, we got to say at this point, this sort of reflection is maybe harder to inspire in others or to practice in yourself in these sort of days of constant distraction and passive entertainment and addictive social media. It's a little harder to do this than it used to be. That is not just me, some old guy lamenting the golden days of my youth when people read books and stuff. This is these are solid conclusions and, dare we say, critical judgments from a host of researchers out there. But I make the point only to emphasize that social media largely teaches us to confirm our reactions to artifacts and express the confirmations. It teaches us to do that more than it does to see alternative explanations and nuance. As a critic, you're supposed to be reaching for that latter experience, that degree of theoreo, of intense, deep reflection on what we've seen or discovered. That has, let's be honest, never been easy, okay? For crying out loud, Plato complained about how hard it was back in ancient Greece to give full attention to something. So nobody is saying making judgments rooted in theory is easy, ever. it's hard. It's tough to do this, but it is at least as hard today as it's ever been. We could say fairly. In the end, your judgments about this artifact will, of course, flow from your theory about how communication works and what is important in the communication process. Now, this very demanding idea of theory and how theory guides and interacts with method is extremely complex. And we will have to return to it later in these presentations. But for now, let's just park it here and unpack it in a bit more depth later. So meanwhile, let's summarize this first part just a little bit, okay? Criticism is a process of making reasoned judgments. We now know that the reasoning that goes on in criticism is going to be guided by our method, right? That method is just simply a set of orderly, organized instructions to guide how we're going to approach and think about this artifact. And what we get from the method, the result, if you will, the outcome of method, is basically data or information about how the artifact works. But both of those words, data, information, they can be really misleading in this context. We're not collecting data like scientists do, as we'll see very clearly in our next lesson. What we mean in the end is that by following the directions in your method, when you think about your artifact, you're going to see things, new things, about how this message is working to communicate something. Now, we've seen that once you have that sense of how the message works, we've followed those patterns, we've done the disciplined, orderly progression of steps and ideas. We've seen that once we've done that, we're going to have to make judgments about the message and its workings. So method shows us how something is happening. Our judgment is going to account for more than just how. And just like method guides our reasoning, theory will guide our judgments, our interpretation of the artifact. Okay, so that's what we've seen so far. And that sort of wraps up our definition of criticism for now. And we are ready to take a giant step back for a bigger overview of the critical world so that we can put our own academic efforts into the broader context of the university as a whole. So far, what I've been saying about criticism is applicable to most areas of criticism. But all my examples have leaned toward, and the framing that we've been giving you, it's all leaned toward, of course, our own field. And I've concentrated on communication. We're now going to think about the bigger picture and give our attention to the areas in which artifacts are found. That is, we're going to talk about the vast arenas where humans go through the process of making reasoned judgments. So the areas of criticism, that'll be coming up in our next installment of this lesson.